Okay, so my talk will be, well, a bit on a similar route, but will be also a discussion with psychoanalysis. So the question is, how do we make sense of the unconscious, basically? And this pertains to the relation between phenomenology and psychoanalysis, which is a difficult relation. The main reason being their conflicting views about the conscious and the unconscious. So for psychoanalysis, the consciousness is more or less mere a sphere of semblance, a surface which deceives us and conceals the actual forces and processes in the depth of the psyche. Whereas for phenomenology, on the other hand, consciousness is the medium in which phenomena come to be seen, manifest themselves. So consciousness on the one hand as a sphere of mere semblance, or as a sphere of manifestation, which is of course a very difficult, very different concept. And the same contrasting views apply to the unconscious. The unconscious for psychoanalysis is the actual source of the psyche's life, its hidden driving force. Whereas the unconscious for phenomenology cannot be seen as more than an implicit awareness, which remains in principle accessible to consciousness. To quote Husserl, and this at this occasion, what I do not know, what in my experience, my imagination, thinking, doing is not present to me as perceived, remembered or thought, will not influence my mind. And what is not in my experience, be it ignored or implicitly and intentionally decided, does not motivate me even unconsciously. So these two views seem hardly reconcilable. Now, what was the beginning? Freud certainly had discovered a paradoxical truth, namely the ambiguity of consciousness, as manifested, for example, in the well-known Freudian slips, misspeaking, mishearing, intentionally forgetting, etc. So the paradox is, as Freud writes, that one knows something that one simultaneously doesn't know, and that one is struck with blindness while the eyes can see. But Freud was only able to solve this paradox by splitting the psyche into two foreign parts. And as a consequence, the unconscious turned into an internal foreign country, as something within oneself, which is alien to the subject. The ego is not master in its own house, as the famous sentence goes. Now, the phenomenological critique of this concept moved along various paths. I will only mention two of them. Sartre conceived the unconscious not as something outside the subject, but as a basic modality of the subject's relation to himself, namely the relation of bad faith or mauvaise foi, which means that the subject assumes an ambivalent relation to himself, sliding or letting himself slide into an intentional inattention. So one doesn't know something and one doesn't want to know it. One doesn't see something and doesn't want to see it, and by this becomes the deceiver and the deceived in one. Now, second, there is the possibility of taking the ambiguity of the lived body as the starting point, as Merleau-Ponty did. And then it becomes possible to encounter the unconscious in everyday behavior, in the bodily behavior, in the day-to-day living, and in the structures of a person's lived space. And then this wouldn't be an unconscious in some unknown depths of the psyche. It wouldn't be an unconscious in the vertical dimension, but it would be an unconscious in the horizontal dimension of the lived body and of our relation to others. And for this, implicit or body memory plays a special part, plays a special role, as we will see. And this second possibility is which I will follow in my talk. So the question will be, can the unconscious be localized in the lived relationships and behavior of a person, in the horizontal dimension of the lived body and intercorporeality? In what follows, I will first want to develop the concept of body memory, and then look for the lived space that surrounds the body, so to speak, the field of relations that it constitutes. And then I will look at the structures of this field where the unconscious can be found, so to speak. Now, if we regard the body not as the visible, touchable, physical body, but rather as our capacity to see and to touch and to sense, then body memory denotes the totality of these bodily capacities, habits, dispositions, as they have developed in the course of one's life. So through repetition of experiences, a habit structure has formed. Well-practiced patterns of movement and perception have been embodied as skills or capacities that we apply in our everyday lives as a matter of course. But body memory does not direct ourselves or take ourselves back to the past. It rather enacts the past without conscious remembering. And therefore, it may also be called implicit memory. So the lived body is the ensemble of acquired and organically developed capacities to perceive, to act, to desire, and to communicate. Its experiences, anchored in body memory, cover the environment like an invisible network which relates us to things and to other people. It is important to note that what is mediated by body memory is mostly forgotten in terms of explicit memory. And an example which I like very much is the capacity of typewriting, which is a memory in the fingers, which is unavailable for explicit knowledge. So if you're able to typewrite, you could hardly tell which keys correspond to the word, let's say, memory. Where's the M, where's the E, where's the O or R? You would easily find them when once you put your fingers on the keyboard, and maybe you do that if you try imagining to type the word memory. And if you do that, you can now test whether you have found them. In any case, you immediately realize that there is no conscious memory and no conscious knowledge of where the types, of where the keys are, but the knowledge is in your fingers. This is a general characteristic of body memory. Now, body memory does not only relate to objects and things we deal with, but also to others. In the structures of bodily experience, and particular in bodily resonance, the others are always already included. Before I reflect on what I communicate, my body already has established a relation, a resonance with others. And this intercorporeality comprises the self and the others, the conscious and the unconscious. As Merleau-Ponty writes, I do not have to search very far for others. I find them in my experience. They are lodged in the hollows that show what they see and what I fail to see. So we are in no way locked inside ourselves. Now, body memory thus forms a system which is not restricted to the physical body. It also constitutes a sensory-motor, emotional, and interactive field in which we constantly move and behave. So what offers itself here is the terminology of Kurt Lewin, a famous German psychologist of the first half of the 20th century. Kurt Lewin's field psychology, particularly the concept of the life space, with its center in the lived body. And I want to give a brief outline of this concept of the topological or field psychology. The lived space or life space is the totality of the space that a person pre-reflectively inhabits and experiences. It is centered around the person and the person's body. It is further characterized by qualities such as closeness versus distance, wideness, narrowness, connection or separation, attainability, and so on. And this produces more or less, and it is also structured by physical or symbolic boundaries, which offer some kind of resistance to free movement. And this produces more or less clearly delimited domains, such as the peripersonal space around one's own body, or claimed territories, one's property, one's home, spheres of influence, or also prohibited zones or taboo zones. All kinds of qualitative domains. The lived space is further permeated by field forces, for example, attraction, repulsion. Competing forces, so to speak, and such conflicting, attractive or repulsive forces lead to typical conflicts, such as attraction versus aversion, attraction versus attraction, etc. And they can be considered as conflicting directions of movement or possibilities which offer themselves to a person in a given situation. Moreover, the life space is also characterized by effects of gravitation, radiation, or even by curvatures of space. A good example of such conflicting field forces and curvatures is offered by the situation of a small child in vicinity to her mother or his mother. And the child is torn back and forth between his bond to his mother and curiosity for exploration of the environment. So first, the mother is the safe haven, the center of gravity, so to speak, which curves the child's experience space in such a way that the child remains rather in her vicinity. So the space acquires a gradient. If the child moves away from the mother, then the more distant he is from the mother, the more empty and the more lonely the space becomes. It may condense around other strange people again, but here the child will rather make a detour around them, so the space is negatively curved around them. Little by little, the child's exploratory drive loses his ties to his mother, so it becomes increasingly possible to increase the distance against the gradient. but only to the point where the bond is stretched too much and the child runs back to his mother in the end. So I think this nicely illustrates what is meant by field forces, gravitation, and so on. And this example is also a good illustration of the fact that the field structures are based on body memory. In this case, the history of the experiences the child has had in closeness and security with his mother. So attachment research has shown this in detail. So from birth on, body memory incorporates and extracts typical experiences with others, and thus acquiring dyadic patterns of interaction, or what Daniel Stern has called schemes of being with. Another interesting and proverbial example of body memory lies in the saying, the burnt child dreads the fire. At least that's the German proverb. In English, it's once bitten, twice shy, which illustrates a negative or aversive effect of body memory, in this case, pain memory, which leads to a mostly unconscious implicit avoidance of similar situations. And the third example, finally, is given by zones of prohibition and interdiction, which restrict the child's movements so that his spontaneous impulses interfere with the parental imperatives. So they also have left a negative gradient on the life space of the child. So we see that the life space, depending on the respective experiences of a person, can carry various significances and relevances. Gravitational effects, curvatures of space, barriers, and so on. Particularly in psychopathology, we encounter various alterations of the lived space. For example, the zones of avoidance in anxiety disorders, or the taboo zones, the zones of impurity in OCD, in obsessive patients, which are based on certain past experiences and have sedimented in body memory. Now, this is a brief sketch of a concept which also allows us to conceive the unconscious in a different way. If we reject Freud's idea of a separate unconscious below subjectivity, then the unconscious might be found not in the vertical dimension, in the depth of the psyche, but, as I already said, in the horizontal dimension of the lived body and the lived space. And such an unconscious would be found not in our innermost sphere behind the back of consciousness, but before us as the structure of our field. It would be the unrecognized reverse side of our embodied being towards the world. Sorry. Now, as a starting point, let me consider the field structure of a repressed wish. In his short story, The Brandy Drinker and the Bells of Berlin, Heinrich von Kleist, the German writer, reports the story of an alcoholic soldier who, after insistent preaching and punishment, had solemnly resolved to become abstinent from now on. Yet after only 3 days, he was found completely drunk again. He was asked how this relapse could have happened after all his good resolutions, and the soldier justified himself by saying that the devil must have had his hand in it because, while walking through the town, he began to hear the names of various brandies and liquors in the tolling of the bells. Here it is important to know the German names for brandies, which is, for example, Kümmel or Pomeranzen, So he heard the names of various brandies, Kimmel, Kimmel, in the ringing of the town hall bell, and Pomeranzen, Pomeranzen, Pomeranzen. So in the ringing cathedral bell, so in the at low pitch, deeper, and so on. So in the end, he couldn't help being defeated by these insidious sounds, he claimed. Well, this is certainly a rather humorous example, and it relates to a wish which was not actually repressed, but merely suppressed by an act of will. But it gives a fine illustration of the indirect way in which contrary bodily impulses or drives can get their way, namely from the outside. They are heard in the environment. So the experiential field is, so to speak, permeated by a suppressed bodily desire, which finally becomes crystallized in certain perceptions, in this case, in the various tolling of the bells. So the wish was not satisfied, and the wish that was not satisfied breaks through by a detour and from the outside. So that in principle, we can already recognize here the mechanism of displacement, Verschiebung. So what is actually desired is fulfilled in the perceptual field through something similar, but less prohibited. A comparable interference of explicit intentions and implicit directions is also found in the various types of Freudian slips. Mishearing, misplacing, misspeaking, forgetting, etc. Freud himself says that slips are the result of two different intentions which interfere with one another, of which one can be called the disturbed and the other the disturbing intention. So mishearing is almost like the example of Kleist's soldier. A latently desired meaning is interpreted from a similar sequence of sounds. Similarly, with slips of the tongue, with mislaying or losing things, another intention interferes with the explicitly intended action, so that the right hand literally doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And finally, with forgetting, an unpleasant intention is blanked out and replaced by another one, for example, by routine processes. And thus, in all these cases, a latent intention wins through by spontaneous bodily inaction, in a kind of reversal or a chiasm, which is expressed by the prefix mis. Now, the producer of the slip, the person, can either recognize its significance and ascribe it somehow to himself, or he finds it strange, puzzling, senseless, in other words, alien to himself. And that's what Freud writes. If later we present the intention on which the misspeaking was based to the speaker, he may either acknowledge it as something familiar, so that it was only temporarily unconscious, or he may deny it as alien to himself, which means that it was permanently unconscious. And it is on this difference that Freud bases a very categorical distinction between the preconscious and the dynamic unconscious, which is repressed or excluded from consciousness by living forces, as he writes. However, the question is, does this really justify establishing a special intra-psychic space for the dynamic unconscious? I think if we do not attribute the living forces of repression to an inter-psychic mechanism beyond consciousness, but if we see them rather as dynamic field forces, we will easily find analogies for such repression or avoidance in the lived body and life space. The first thing that comes to mind would be, for example, the relieving posture that we adopt implicitly, unconsciously, after sustaining an injury. Spontaneously, one avoids putting the injured limb at risk from dangerous objects, holds it back without having still to think of the injury of the event. So avoidance behavior is incorporated into body memory. Moreover, I have already mentioned the zones of prohibition, which face the child as a negative field force until the child respects them automatically. We come one step closer to the dynamic unconscious with zones or objects of taboo. Because unlike prohibition, the taboo has a special structure. It is not expressly formulated, but it is generated by the avoidance behavior of others. It works like a negative curvature of the shared life space around what is excluded or prohibited. And taboos are most effective when they are not explicitly declared and the members of the community are not even aware of them.
Thomas, there are 4 minutes resting.
Okay. In all these cases, experience and conduct are determined by negative or repulsive field forces exercising their effect unconsciously. And this avoidance has become an implicit bodily pattern which creates a repulsive space in the lived space, so to speak. Nevertheless, the repelling forces come not from the outside, but as a negativity within experience itself. They are part of the experiential field. And the manifest feelings of fear, guilt, or shame which arise on the stepping beyond the barriers are already latently present both before, and they endow these barriers with their unpleasant affective loading. So this means an ambiguity or duplicity of consciousness itself, in such a way that the subject, if she hits on the manifestation of the hidden meaning, at least has a hunch that it means something to her. I've skipped the next slide and turn to another phenomenon, namely the unconscious effect of emotional trauma, which Merleau-Ponty also interprets as an unconscious after effect, which resembles the phantom limb in amputated patients. So it constitutes an empty space of lived subjectivity, so to speak. There is an invisible trace of a past experience which permeates each novel situation unnoticed. The traumatized person becomes hypersensitive to threatening, shaming situations which are somehow similar to the trauma, even if this similarity is not consciously recognized, and he tries to circumvent them. All the same, at every step, the victim may encounter something that reawakens the trauma in her. Often it happens that a permanent predisposition develops to react with fear and nervousness. The effect of the trauma can thus be regarded as a specific alteration of her lived space, an unconscious avoidance of repulsive zones or anxiety-provoking zones. The lived space around these is to a certain extent negatively curved. And lived space is also permeated with similarities through which the trauma approaches the traumatized person from outside. An impressive description of this is found in the memories of the Jewish writer Aaron Appelfeld, who from his 7th to his 13th year of age experienced the Second World War, hiding in the woods of Ukraine. And he writes many years later, "More than 50 years have passed since the end of the war. I have forgotten much, even things that were very close to me. places in particular, dates and the names of people. And yet I can still sense those days in every part of my body. Whenever it rains, it's cold, or a fierce wind is blowing, I'm taken back to the ghetto, to the camp, or to the forests where I spent many days. Memory, it seems, has deep roots in the body. The cells of my body apparently remember more than my mind, which is supposed to remember. For years after the war, I would walk neither in the middle of the sidewalk, nor in the middle of the road. I always clung to the walls, always staying in the shade and always walking rapidly as if I were fleeing. Sometimes just the aroma of a certain dish or the dampness of shoes or a sudden noise is enough to take me back in the middle of the war. The war has infiltrated my bones. So here it is not a particular episode, but an entire phase of life which has left its mark on the body. Proprioception, touch, smell, hearing, even certain kinds of weather can suddenly reawake the past, and even bodily patterns of movement, such as the hunted walk close to the wall, still imitates the behavior of the fugitive. To conclude, from the point of view of phenomenology, the unconscious is not an intra-psychic reality located in some depth below consciousness. Rather, it surrounds and permeates conscious life, similar to a picture puzzle where one only sees the foreground but overlooks the important structure in the background. It is an unconscious which is not located in the vertical dimension of the psyche, but rather in the horizontal dimension of lived space, most of all lodging in the intercorporeality of dealing with others, as the hidden or reverse side of intersubjectivity. Unconscious fixations are like certain restrictions in a person's space of possibilities, produced by an implicit but ever-present past which declines to take part, which refuses to take part in the continuing progress of life. Its traces, however, are not hidden in an inner psyche, but manifest themselves as blind spots or curvatures in the lived space. And thus the unconscious is absence in presence, the unperceived in the perceived, or the reverse side of conscious life. Like a figure which blanks out the ground from which it stands out, thus consciousness, perception, and language conceal their reverse side, the unconscious, the unperceived, the silence, which are nevertheless always bound up with them. This reverse side, however, does not remain fully concealed, but expresses itself in reversals, chiasmatic entanglements, in an ambiguity of consciousness itself. One doesn't know something and does not want to know it, as Sartre said. One overlooks something and doesn't want to see it. Consciousness is not fully accessible to itself because it hides itself from itself. And this duplicity or ambiguity of consciousness corresponds to the ambivalent, contradictory nature of our existence itself, where we, precisely as natural embodied beings, can always confront our own instinctive and natural side as well. We can take a stance towards ourselves. We are kind of divided between the one and the other, and this is what constitutes the contradictory character of our existence. So I think Freud wrongly placed this contradiction or this opposing will within us in a separate chamber of the psyche. The unconscious is ultimately what we are ourselves, precisely as bodily beings. Thank you very much for your attention.